Hi, I'm Steve from AltAlt. A little while ago, I did a bearing swap video on this race face trace rear hub. And for a while now, I've been pretty excited about doing a bearing swap video on the free hub as well. But I ran into a little trouble. I started by referring back to the schematic drawing for the trace rear hub. Here you can see that there are 6 free hubs that fit onto that hub. They've got aluminum versions and steel versions, and this schematic diagram also has the bearings that go into these free hubs. Well, that's great. So let's grab the part numbers here from the free hubs and head on over to race face. So let's put in the part number. Here it is. Here's the free hub. Here we got all the different versions. That's great. Roll down, we got some specs, we got some reviews. This is where I found the support documentation for the rear hub itself, but I don't see anything here. So I reached out to Raceface. After a couple phone calls, some emails, the end result is Raceface doesn't have any schematic drawings or instructions to swap bearings on the trace free hub. So this situation where you don't have any manufacturer's instructions or you don't have any schematic diagrams is a lot more common than you might think. So this seems like an opportunity to do a bearing swap video based on what you can see and some general bearing swap basics. If not applied correctly, the force to remove and install bearings can be enough to damage bike parts. I can't cover every single detail of every single situation in one video, so just remember, I'm trying to help. I just can't be responsible for everything. Take time to learn about what you're doing and proceed cautiously. If you got a question that I haven't covered, email me. It's how I learn about the tools that you want and the problems that you're having. Thanks. What I've got here are 2 different designs of free hub body. Now, aside from the fact that this free hub is HG and this free hub is microspline, both of these free hubs are designed to go with the trace rear hub. Now, if you take a look at the outboard side, you can see that in both cases you can see the bearing outer ring. If you look real close here, you can see the full bearing outer ring. Nothing is impeding the movement of this bearing in this direction other than the friction caused by the interference fit between the free hub body and the bearing outer ring. So that means that this bearing comes out in this direction, which is similar to the other free hub design. Now, where these 2 designs differ is on the inboard side of the free hub. Now, this version is, I believe, an older version because this version is currently on their website. If you look at any of the aluminum or any of the steel, whether it's in HG, microspline, or XD/XDR, this is what the free hub bodies look like. So this is the older one. So if you take off this metal plate that's holding the pawls in place, this free hub body looks like this. Now, once again, you can see the bearing outer ring, which means that this bearing also comes out in this direction. So on this design, both bearings come out outwards. On this design, if you remove this cover, and you can do that by taking a screwdriver and gently and carefully pushing inwards and then up, you can remove this plastic cover. The plastic cover comes off. And that's handy to know because if you're just pulling straight on it, it's really resistant to coming out. So if you look at the end of this free hub body, you can't see the bearing outer ring in there. The free hub body is in the way, which means that that bearing gets removed in this direction. So both bearings in this design come out in this direction. Designed for the same application, fundamentally different. You got to treat them differently. So let's take a look at the older free hub. So Let's take a look at this one because it's actually a little bit simpler than the other free hub. Remove the screws, take the plate off so that you can remove the pawls and get them out of the harm's way. Make sure to put everything else in a little baggie or something so that you don't lose the tiny little springs. So here's the free hub. Now, taking a look at this design, we got a bearing that comes out each side separated by an internal spacer. That's actually very, very similar to a lot of front hubs where you have a bearing at either end separated by a spacer. So a lot of what we're doing here is actually going to be applicable to front hubs as well. Before we remove a bearing in this free hub, note the color of the seals on the bearings. Manufacturers will color the bearings according to what kind of bearing it is. Now, there's no real standard as to what color they use, but you have bearings that have the same color seal on both sides, or you have bearings that have different color seals on either side. Now, if the bearing has the same color seal on both sides, it's symmetrical. It doesn't matter which way you put it in. But if the bearing has two different color seals, it's meant to go in a particular orientation. So you have to consult your manufacturer for that. But before we take it apart, we're going to note what color is pointing outwards so that we can install the bearings, the new bearings, in the same manner. So on this free hub, just take a note. Red seals pointing outwards. So to remove a bearing, normally you have to leverage some way, somehow, up against the part, and then access the back side of the bearing to press it out or to knock it out, whatever. So with this design, you can see that there's an internal spacer running from bearing inner ring to bearing inner ring, and it kind of impedes you from easily accessing the back side of the bearing. Well, there's two ways for this to play out. Oh, I'm missing my spacer. Here we go. If the bearing spacer shifts off to the side a little bit, that's done so that you can stick a punch in and up against the back side of the bearing inner ring. Then you take your trusty soft hammer and you whack on the end of the punch and knock the bearing out. But you do it by giving it some taps on this side, then moving the punch, giving it some taps on that side. So essentially what you're doing is you're walking the bearing out. Now, what I don't like about doing this is you never know how tight a bearing is in the bearing bore. If it's old, it could be very tight. If it's new, it might be a little looser. If the bearing was installed with grease, if it wasn't installed with grease. So there's a lot of factors. You never really know how. And if you put the punch up against one side and you give it a good whack and it just pops right out, then it popped out crooked and you run the risk of damaging the bearing bore. And if you damage it too much, the bearing will be loose in there and you need to replace the part. So that's why I designed the alt drift. How the alt drift works is it works similarly to a punch in that the alt drift fits up against the bearing inner ring, and then as you tighten the tool, it presses up against a different part of the bearing inner ring. So as you tighten it, it turns it out. Now the beauty of this is that it works with the screwing motion so that you can apply exactly as much force as you want to push that bearing out. And it does it in a very straight manner. So we're going to be using the Alt hub and suspension bearing press with the optional handle and the Alt D1 alt drift kit. Okay, before I go on, the second way that this can play out, if the bearing spacer does not move off to the side, you're going to need some kind of a bearing puller. Now that's a device like this, and it's got some jaws on the end of it, and as you tighten this device, the jaws expand. So you take a bearing, install this inside, you expand the jaws, and on this design, it's got a lip here. And this lip will catch the back side of the bearing inner ring. Gives it something to grab onto. Now, if you remember from this design, that's where the bearing spacer is. It's the same ID as the bearing ID, so there's nowhere for that tool to expand into. So you need a bearing puller without this little lip on it, and that's sometimes called a blind bearing puller. Now, all of these bearing pullers work similarly. You can attach a rod here with a big heavy weight on it, and it hammers out the bearing, or some of them work. You could put a punch in this end and you hammer on the end of the punch and it yanks it out. You got to keep it aligned, otherwise everything comes out crooked. And I don't think I've ever heard anybody say, oh boy, I can't wait to use a blind bearing puller. So we're going to continue on using this. Hopefully you don't have to use a blind bearing puller. So let's remove one of these bearings. Let's remove the inboard side bearing first. It's got a nice flat leverage surface up against it, so let's start there. So the first thing to do is grab some pieces. We're going to grab an alt drift. We're going to grab the largest alt drift that fits inside the bearing ID. This is going to press on the bearing inner ring. The alt drift works with the alt rod. We need a centering piece, so this is going to be a pilot. Use one of the short pilot, not the long pilot, the largest one that fits inside the bearing ID. We're going to need to put an O-ring on the end of the pilot there to keep the pilot in place. Then we're going to need to choose some leveraging tools. So this sleeve is large enough for that bearing to clear when it comes out. So this piece leverages up against the body and it's got clearance for the bearing. The sleeve works in conjunction with the step. Now, the step has two sides to it. This side is too loose, this side is tight. Always choose the tighter side. Then it's just a matter of assembling the tool. So grab your stud, thread the alt drift on, give it an inch, 3/4 of an inch, something like that. Thread the alt rod on until it bottoms. Tighten the alt drift back up against the alt rod, and then it's time to put it into the free hub. So we're removing this bearing out this side. So install the alt drift from the opposite side. Push the bearing spacer off to the side. Now the alt drift is pressing up against the back side of the inner ring. Grab the pilot, put the pilot inside the bearing. Now the alt drift is up against the back side of the bearing and centered. So we'll just put an O-ring on to keep the pilot in place while we're working on this. Now we install the leveraging part. And then it's a matter of putting a threaded part on this side. Now you could use a nut, but with a long stud like this with this kit, just use the stud stop. Now the stud stop goes on at an angle, in place, straighten it out, and then tighten it with this side. That way the stud stop stays nice and straight and engaged on the threads. Then grab an Allen key to fit inside the end here. Do not turn this end. If you turn this end, it'll act like a punch, and as you tighten the tool, it'll only press on one side of the bearing ring and just pull the bearing out crooked. Do not tighten this side. Hold this steady and turn this side. Should sometimes cracks, and then you can feel it moving. It takes just a couple of turns. If it doesn't move, stop and take this apart and see if anything is not aligning properly. Maybe you chose the wrong size sleeve, and as the bearing's coming out, it's actually bumping into here. You don't have enough clearance, so you need to choose a larger size. But works great, works fast. And there is the bearing and the spacer. Okay, before we continue, let's take a look at this outboard or inboard bearing. red seal that points outwards, and black seal on the inside. So now we know that this is an angular contact bearing, which is not symmetrical, so it needs to be oriented in a certain fashion. So knowing that, we just got to remember, red seal is going to point outwards when we reinstall the bearing. Similarly, just have a look at the spacer. Straightforward, just a metal tube, no other features on it whatsoever, so symmetrical. So let's move on to removing this second bearing, the outboard bearing. I think to remove this, we'll just use a standard process. We'll leverage up against the body here, and we'll press on the back side of the bearing, pressing on the bearing inner ring to do that. So let's choose some pieces. We need a drift to do the pressing, and the drift needs to be larger than the bearing inner ring. So that's going to press up against the whole inner ring. We're going to need a pilot, the largest pilot that fits inside the bearing. That's good, we'll use that. We'll be pressing inside here, so we could go ahead and use a spacer tube to get us a little bit of length there. And we're going to need a leveraging piece. So we'll pick one of the sleeves. Now, when choosing a sleeve to leverage up against a thin surface like this, choose a sleeve that really tries to sit in the middle of this. If it's leveraging against just this edge here, it may slip and deform. So there is, everyone I've ran into so far, there is a sleeve to match the body. So this is the one for this free hub. Works with the step, too loose. There we go, that's the right side. So let's assemble a tool. I'm going to use the handle this time. I like to start with the pressing side. There's the drift that will do the pressing, the pilot that'll do the centering. Oh, and we're going to need an O-ring to keep this all kind of in place. I'm just going to use any other part to push that O-ring down. All right, so now this goes in from the inside. There, the pilot's centering the tool on the bearing inner ring. We've got the leveraging tool, which has clearance for the bearing to come out into. There we go, it's nicely centered, squared. I like using the stud stop because it's so fast. Oh, fell apart. There we go. There we go, just quick and easy. There's the bearing. Yeah, once again, red seal outwards. So 2 angular contact bearings, 1 in each side. Great, we got the bearings out. Now it's a matter of cleaning this out with some isopropyl alcohol. Maybe you got to get a toothpick into these little corners here where the bearings sit. That cleans things up really nicely. And prepare for a bearing install. So let's install the first bearing into this free hub body. We'll do it in the reverse order from the removal that we just did. So that means we're going to do the outboard bearing first. It's all cleaned up and ready to go. Other than having the new bearing in the correct orientation, there isn't much else to look for. There's nothing impeding it. We're not going to have any clearance issues because everything's happening kind of at the ends. Should be pretty straightforward. So let's start choosing some tool pieces to press that bearing into that. Now, we're not using any grease on the outside of this bearing ring. It is common to use grease. Some manufacturers require it, others don't. I just know from other race face hub products that they don't recommend it. And since there's no instructions, we're gonna just kind of go along with that. So should be good. It is quite common to have bearings installed without grease on the bearing outer ring. So let's choose some tool pieces to get this done. First tool we're going to need to do some pressing is a drift, and it needs to be the same outer diameter as the bearing itself. So same diameter. That's great. So that's the drift we're going to use. Pilot is going to be the largest pilot that fits into the bearing ID. When installing, or well, actually with any function that you're trying to do, I like to use the longest pilot possible. It keeps the part stable as best as possible, and especially applicable when you have very wide bearings. So since this is going in like this, I think we're going to have lots of clearance to work with, so we're not going to run into a problem. So we're going to use this large pilot for that. We're going to use an O-ring to hold the pilot in place. And then because this bearing is going into the free hub body, there's a little distance to make up, so we'll use the tube spacer to space it off a bit. Now for the leveraging side of this part, there's a couple different ways you can do it. Today we're going to do it using the stop center. Now this part has kind of a cone shape to it, so it fits inside holes and it keeps things centered this way. So this is the part that we're going to use today. As an alternative, if you have more parts and if you have more drifts, you could actually use a second one of these to fit in the bearing bore. Some manufacturers recommend that, so it would be really handy if I started selling piece parts. Wink, wink. So for today, we're going to use the stop center to leverage and center. Okay, so let's get started assembling the tool. Grab the stud. Going to go start with the pressing side again. The drift does the pressing, the pilot does the centering. O-ring holds everything in place. Put the bearing onto the tool, red side facing outwards. That fits into the bearing bore, and then we're going to install, or we're going to leverage the opposite side with the stop center. Okay, there we go. All centered up. Looking good. Turn the tool and the bearing goes in. It's very obvious when it stops. No need to press any harder than that. All right, that bearing is in place. Can't tell if it's all the way in just by looking at it, but when we install the spacer tube and the other bearing, we'll see if there's any play in the spacer tube, and that'll let us know that this bearing is in the right place and the other bearing is in the right place. So let's continue on with the second bearing. Now to install the second bearing, the inboard bearing, you have to consider that you're going to be putting a spacer in between the two bearings. Now this spacer, it just goes in and it'll find its home, which is all fine and good, but when you're screwing everything together, it's got to stay lined up. If it gets cockeye in there, it gets hung up on something that might be inside the free hub or in a hub, it's important to keep this centered on the bearing inner ring. So I like to use a combination of the pilots that I have here. So let's start with picking some of the parts. First we're going to need a pressing part for the bearing, and I think it's that drift, yeah. So this drift presses. We're going to need a pilot to center on the bearing inner ring. In this case, we're going to use the small pilot on this side against the drift. We're going to use an O-ring to hold it in place. We're going to end up using another pilot. We're going to use the second pilot, but we're going to use it on the first bearing. So what we're going to do actually is we're going to put this pilot in here, and it's long, so what's going to happen is the spacer tube is going to slide over this and center onto the first bearing. So we'll assemble the tool so that that happens. And then what we're going to need at the very other end is something to leverage here. Now, we could use the stop center to leverage. It also centers, but since we have the pilot in there holding everything together, the tool is already centered. So we might as well just use a larger part, like a drift. We could go much larger, and then just fit flush up against the end. And this is going to stay centered because of that pilot. So let's go ahead and use that. So once again, we're going to start assembling the tool from the pressing end. So let's get the handle on. The drift, is the drift going to reach? Yeah, the bearing sits right up against the end, so the drift is going to reach. So we can just leave it right up against the handle. That does the pressing. The pilot does the centering. And we hold that pilot in place with an O-ring. There. So now the bearing goes on, and the bearing goes on red ring outwards. So that way. Okay, so we're going to want to get this in there. And we're going to put that like, there we go. So now this is all flopping around in here, as you can see. So let's put a pilot in there, and that should center everything up really nicely. It'll hold on to that spacer tube. There, get everything all lined up. Pilot's sitting there nicely in the center. And because there's a little bit of a gap here, we don't want the pilot to move again. So I'm going to put another O-ring on and push it up against the pilot. There, that's all stable. Use a drift on the opposite side to leverage. And since this bearing is going in this way, we're not going to have any clearance problems. So it should be a matter of just tightening the tool up, pushing that second bearing in. Okay. Okay, now this time when the bearing seated, it's seated up against the housing of the free hub body, and it's seated up against the bearing spacer. So using a flat drift like this that contacts the bearing on the inner ring and outer ring seats things really nicely. So let's take a look here. So you look inside, it looks like the spacer is touching both bearings. Looks good. Spin everything around nice and smooth. That's good. Spacer doesn't move around too easily. It's not flopping around, it's not rattling around, which means everything's in place. So that's it. Swap the bearings in a free hub. As easy as that. And if you weren't taking notes, I've got some diagrams on the website that'll help you. Check out the instructional diagrams page and look for free hub, bearings installed, one from each side. There you'll find all of the instructions or the diagrams for removing both bearings and installing both bearings. Okay, so now let's explore what I think is the newer version of the Race Face Trace free hub body. This is the one where both bearings come out the outboard side of the body. Hey, sorry, I ran out of videotape. I guess now is a good time to suggest that you subscribe and hit the bell icon so that you get notifications. I should be able to put part 2 of this video up next week. And as leaked in the video, there's going to be some new announcements for Alt-Alt, so stay tuned.